A storm of horsemen rose from the steppe, striking without warning, burning kingdoms to ash. They had nothing, no cities, no palaces, no mighty kings or empires to boast of. Yet their name alone brought kings to their knees. These were not the Mongols or the Huns. They were the Cimmerians, the world's first terrifying nomads. The Cimmerians were once dismissed as mere wanderers, people with no civilization. Yet they proved to be far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. They lived as horse-riding warriors bound not to cities with walls of stone, but to the endless grasslands. Their strength was not in castles, but in speed. Their cities were their tents. Their walls were their horses. They rode into battle with unmatched skill, striking fear into kings as they burned kingdoms to ash. Mighty empires trembled at their advance, and even some of the greatest armies begged for their service in their ranks. From a people the world thought weak and insignificant, they became a shadow stretching across empires. They were an untamable terror no empire saw coming. But the origin of the Cimmerians did not begin in an empire or any grand palace. It began in the wide open world of the Eurasian steppe, north of the Black Sea. This was their first homeland. Here, the Cimmerians lived as nomads, fast, mobile, and free. Their children grew up in the saddle. Their warriors drew strength from the endless plains that stretched to the horizon. Ancient Greek and Near Eastern sources described them as restless wanderers, always on the move, always ready for war. But even skill and speed could not save them from the fate that all nomads feared. In the late 8th century BCE, another fierce nomadic power, the Scythians, swept in from the east. They were as ruthless and skilled as the Cimmerians, but stronger and more numerous. Their arrival changed everything. Around 720 to 710 BCE, the Scythians forced the Cimmerians out of the Pontic steppe, driving them out of their ancestral homeland. It was a moment of crisis, so deep it was remembered in legend for centuries. According to Herodotus, when the Scythians invaded the Cimmerian lands, the Cimmerian chiefs faced a terrible choice. They could either abandon their ancestral land or die upon it. They chose death in their homeland over life in exile. Herodotus stated that the Cimmerian chiefs met by the great river Tiras, which we now call the Dniester. They stood on a burial mound where their fathers lay. Too proud to run, too proud to live as wanderers, they killed one another there. Meanwhile, the rest of the tribe, the women, the children, and the young warriors, they had no such choice. They gathered their herds, mounted their horses, and rode south. They left behind their dead, their chiefs, and the steppe that had been their only home. They rode into the lands the ancients called Asia, torn from their past and cast into exile. It was the birth of a wandering people, a people hardened by loss, carrying not only their families, but a fury that would soon shake the empires of the ancient world. They carried their rage with them as they crossed the Caucasus Mountains into the Near East, where kingdoms would soon feel the weight of their fury. By the middle of the 7th century BCE, the Cimmerians had already carved a violent path into history. They crossed the Caucasus with their horses and arrows, and on the other side, they found kingdoms to destroy. At first, people believed them to be a rumor. Royal intelligence reports from the reign of Assyrian King Sargon II, 722 to 705 BCE, recorded the earliest known mentions of these wanderers. The Assyrians called them Gimirri or Gimirri. For a time, They seemed like shadows on clay tablets, wild riders no one had yet seen. But shadows can move, and when they did, they carried terror across empires. By 714 BCE, rumors became reality. The Assyrians learned that Rusa I of Urartu, the powerful mountain king of eastern Anatolia, had attacked a land of Gimirri, hoping to crush this rising threat before it grew. Urartu was a kingdom of stone fortresses, feared across Anatolia. Yet when Rusa's men met the Cimmerians, Urartu was defeated. The Cimmerians struck down one of the region's great powers. By the mid-700s 10 BCE, the Cimmerians had carved out a stronghold in Transcaucasia, perhaps in the lands we know today as Central Georgia. And from there, they struck again. Another report soon reached Assyria that Cimmerian horsemen had invaded Urartu a second time, slipping in from the southeast through Manai, south of Lake Urmia. It was as if a storm had broken over the mountains. The Cimmerian horsemen darted like lightning across the northern edges of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, harrying Urartu, burning villages and terrifying neighboring states. In only a few years, the Cimmerians had transformed from shadows in a report to a storm pressing at the borders of empires. Even Assyria's great king Sargon II could not ignore them. Though records say he never fought the Cimmerians in open battle, he knew the threat they posed, and so did other kings. Around 710 BCE, Assyrian archives record a desperate plea from a foreign king, a man named Mitta'ah, very likely King Midas of Phrygia, begging Sargon for protection against the dreaded Gimirri. The fact that one of Anatolia's proudest kings would beg Assyria for help shows how dangerous the Cimmerians had become. Whether Assyria sent help or not is unknown. But we know that Sargon's armies were campaigning in Anatolia at the time. The Cimmerians had become so feared that kingdoms rose or fell depending on whether Assyria could shield them. And yet, the danger they posed only grew worse. One later chronicle claims that in 705 BCE, the Cimmerians tried to breach Assyria's frontier, but Sargon repelled them. Yet, in that same year, Sargon II died in battle in Anatolia, possibly against steppe warriors allied with the Cimmerians. It was a bitter irony. The Assyrian king who had watched the storm gathering was later swept away by it. By the end of Sargon's reign, the Assyrians had seen enough to know the Cimmerians were unlike any enemy they had faced. They came as enemies on horseback, but could just as easily serve as mercenaries with swords for hire. In the years that followed, Assyrian texts reveal that some Cimmerians were captured and forced into service. A legal document from 679 BCE even describes an Assyrian officer commanding a regiment of Cimmerians, showing how easily these wild horsemen could shift from invaders to soldiers under foreign banners. But others sold their swords freely to Assyria's rivals. Urartian records reveal that King Rusa II of Urartu hired Cimmerian bands as auxiliaries. To have them on your side was both a risk and a weapon. Still, the Assyrians never saw the Cimmerians as equals. To the Assyrians, they remained wanderers from the far north. Even their name, Gimirri, which the Assyrians called them, meant people who travel back and forth, a fitting description of their restless nomadic life. This name echoed far beyond Assyria. In the Hebrew Bible, Gomer, a name listed among the sons of Japheth in Genesis 10, from verses 2 to 3, and mentioned again by Ezekiel, is widely believed to reflect the Cimmerians. The name was likely drawn from the Assyrian word Gimirri. Centuries later, The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus confirmed this connection, writing that Gomer's descendants, the Gimirri, were none other than the Cimmerians. And so, through Assyrian cuneiform tablets and biblical verses, the Cimmerians stepped into recorded history. By around 700 BCE, they were firmly rooted south of the Caucasus. But they were not content to stay. Their eyes still roamed, hungry for richer lands. The Cimmerians were preparing to unleash terror and fire into the heart of Anatolia and Mesopotamia. They had not come to stay quietly. They had come to make the world tremble, and they had only just begun. After shaking the borders of Urartu, the restless riders turned on their next victim, which was the proud kingdom of Phrygia in Asia Minor. By 695 BCE, the Cimmerian bands crossed into Phrygian territory and destroyed them. This clash is remembered not only in archaeology, but also in legend. It was during this invasion that King Midas, the most famous ruler of Phrygia, met his tragic end. Strabo, the Roman geographer, claimed that Midas chose death over defeat, taking his own life by drinking bull's blood as the Cimmerians crushed his land. Phrygia's capital, Gordion, also met a fiery end. As Phrygia crumbled, the land did not remain empty. In the years that followed, a new Anatolian power, Lydia, rose from Phrygia's ashes, inheriting Phrygia's place and its enemies. The fall of Phrygia did not echo only in Anatolia. Its shockwaves rippled far south into the very heart of the Assyrian Empire. The great kings of Assyria now had to face the same nomadic terror that had destroyed their neighbors. In 693 BCE, King Sennacherib sent his troops into the northern Tigris region to reassert control over his frontiers. Although Sennacherib's inscriptions do not name the enemy directly, later chronicles suggest the enemy may have been the Cimmerians or their allies in Anatolia. Whoever these enemies were, the encounter left an impression on Assyria. For not long after, Assyria began calling these strangers by name. No longer were the nomads referred to as rumors. They were called the new terror of the north. The storm kept building, and a few years later, Assyria defeated these nomads for the first time in history. In 679 BCE, Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon, faced the nomads again. The Cimmerians had invaded as far south as the Assyrian province of Tabal in central Anatolia or Cappadocia. There, near the city of Hubushna, perhaps in Cilicia or Cappadocia, Esarhaddon's army met the invaders. What followed was a power clash neither side would forget. The battle was fierce. The Cimmerians, hardened by years of exile and conquest, struck with the fury of the steppe. But this time, Assyria held firm. In the end, it was the Cimmerians who were defeated. Esarhaddon's inscriptions boast that he struck down the Cimmerian king Tushpa with his own hand. The nomadic horde was scattered and driven westward. For the first time in history, the Cimmerians were defeated. For the Assyrians, this was more than a battlefield victory. It secured their northern Anatolian frontier, sparing the empire from Cimmerian raids that might have pierced its heartland with fire and plunder. But the Cimmerians did not stay defeated. Yes, they were wounded and scattered, but in the decades that followed, they regrouped and struck again and again on the margins of the civilized world. By the mid-7th century BCE, their raids had become so constant that the period was known as a time of uneasy thrones and restless borders. The Cimmerians were everywhere, from the highlands of Urartu to the valleys of Assyria and even along the coasts of Ionia. Their reputation grew darker with each strike, In palaces and marketplaces alike, one name rippled through whispers of fear: the Cimmerians. They were no longer just invaders. They had become mercenaries, allies, even kingmakers. They brought Urartu low, humbled the Greeks, tormented the Assyrians, and reminded the world that no crown, no citadel, no empire was safe from riders without a homeland. What made the Cimmerians so dangerous was not luck, but skill. They were born and raised in the saddle, living and breathing cavalry warfare. Their way of fighting was unlike anything the armies of Assyria or Lydia had ever faced. Their first secret was speed. The Cimmerians were entirely mounted, moving faster than news of their approach. They could cover great distances in days, appearing where no enemy expected them. Villages that thought themselves safe awoke to the thunder of hooves, and they were struck before an army could even be raised. The bow was their second secret. Like their Scythian cousins, the Cimmerians were masters of horse archery. They could gallop in circles around an enemy line, loosing arrows with terrifying accuracy. And when they pretended to flee, their riders twisted in the saddle to shoot backwards. The infamous trick was later called the Parthian shot. Heavy infantry, chariots, and even cavalry that tried to chase them often fell into this trap, drawn out and broken apart, until the Cimmerians struck again. But their power was not only in swords and arrows, it was also psychological. The mere rumor of their approach sent cities into panic. People fled to the islands of the Aegean when Cimmerian hooves shook the coast of Ionia. In Lydia, the proud walls of Sardis could not save the lower city. The dread of their raids broke spirits as much as their arrows broke bodies. Assyria, master of siege engines and armies that had crushed kingdoms from Egypt to Elam, struggled against them. The late 7th century BCE was an age defined by the clash of worlds, the rigid, disciplined armies of great empires against the fluid, unpredictable horsemen of the steppe. And for a generation, the Cimmerians humbled kings, destroyed cities, and forced empires to bend their alliances or break. They showed that no wall was high enough, no army disciplined enough to stand against riders who refused to fight by the old rules. By the 630s BCE, the kingdoms the Cimmerians had once humbled began to rise again, rebuilding strength from the ashes, and one kingdom, above all others, learned to strike back: the kingdom of Lydia. The story of Lydia's struggle with the Cimmerians was written in blood and kingship. It began around 652 BCE when Lydia, with its capital at Sardis, rose as a regional power under King Gyges. Gyges was a bold ruler who believed he could hold back the storm of nomads. At first, he was right. When Cimmerian raiders tried to invade Lydia borders, Gyges defeated them and drove them back. He even sent Cimmerians captives and spoils to Assyria's mighty king Ashurbanipal around 665 BCE as proof of victory. Ashurbanipal blessed him as an ally, and Gyges aligned himself with Assyria, paying tribute and seeking Ashurbanipal's protection against the nomads. For a brief moment, Assyria and Lydia stood together, and the Cimmerians were kept in check. But Gyges grew ambitious and arrogant. Around 653 BCE, he became dissatisfied with Assyria's limited help. So he broke away from the alliance and sided with Egypt's Pharaoh Psamtik, who was leading an anti-Assyrian revolt. It was a fatal mistake. The Assyrian annals say Gyges' betrayal brought down divine wrath. Ashurbanipal cursed Gyges for his betrayal, praying that disaster would fall upon the Lydian king. Soon after, the Cimmerians returned to Lydia as a tidal wave of destruction. Around 652 BCE, the Cimmerians swept into Lydia in full force. They were led by their fearsome king Tugdame, whom the Greeks later called Ligdamus. Some Thracian tribes, the Treres, under a chief Kobos, also joined them as they invaded Lydia and stormed Sardis. The battle was catastrophic. The nomadic horsemen annihilated Gyges' army, and Sardis was sacked. The city's lower quarters were burned to the ground, its streets turned into rivers of flame. Only the steep Acropolis survived, looming above the smoking ruins. King Gyges was killed by Cimmerian swords during the battle. Assyrians gloated that divine justice had been served. Ashurbanipal's records claimed Gyges' death was punishment from the gods for his arrogance. When Gyges fell, his son Ardis inherited a devastated kingdom in ruins and ashes. Desperate, Ardis tried to undo his father's mistake. He recognized the folly that had doomed Gyges. So, Ardis quickly resumed diplomatic ties with Ashurbanipal's court, hoping to rebuild the old Assyro-Lydian alliance and gain protection against the Cimmerian threat. Whether Assyria truly helped him is uncertain, but the Cimmerians returned in less than 10 years after Gyges' fall. Around 640 to 637 BCE, during Ardis' reign, a fresh wave of nomadic hordes ravaged Lydia's borders. This time, the Cimmerians were joined by the Treres, Thracian tribesmen migrating across the Bosporus, as well as by some Anatolian bands, perhaps the Lycians or Phrygians, who were also hungry for plunder. In 637 BCE, which was the 7th year of Ardis' rule, they struck Sardis a second time. Sardis' fortifications saved only the citadel. Once again, the lower city was sacked. Its treasures were looted, its homes burned, and the capital of Lydia lay in ruins. Ardis vanished from history. Some ancient sources suggest that King Ardis was either killed in this invasion, others suggest he was deposed in disgrace for failing to protect his people from the Cimmerians. His young son, Sadiates, took the throne, but his reign lasted barely 2 years, from about 637 to 635 BCE, before vanishing from history. Some believe he too was killed in yet another Cimmerian raid in 635 BCE. Others think he was cast aside as unfit to rule. In less than 20 years, 2 Lydian kings, Gyges and Ardis, were destroyed by the Cimmerians. Sardis had burned twice. Lydia was scarred, weakened, and on the edge of collapse. After the brief rule of Sadiates, Ardis' grandson Alyattes rose to the throne. Unlike his forefathers, Alyattes had the patience of a survivor. He rebuilt Lydian strength slowly, forging alliances and waiting for the right moment. This time, the gods seemed to favor the Lydians. By then, Assyria itself was desperate to bring an end to the nomadic terror. Around 635 BCE, Scythian King Midas entered Anatolia at Assyria's command, striking against the Cimmerians and their Thracian allies. Alyattes united Lydian forces with Scythian strength. Together, the Scythians struck from the east, while Alyattes' Lydian army pressed from the west. The war lasted for years, not days, until they finally broke the Cimmerians' power. Herodotus tells us it was Alyattes who finally threw the Cimmerians out of Asia. By 600 BCE, the Cimmerian threat had vanished. The Cimmerians, who had burned cities, toppled kings, and haunted empires, were gone. After this, their name faded into silence. No more Gimirri in Assyrian tablets. No more great invasions in Greek memory. They had been erased. The survivors melted into the lands they once terrorized. Some settled in Cappadocia, its Armenian name, Gimirri, still echoing Gimirri. Others joined Lydian cavalry or vanished into Thracian tribes. A few may have fled west toward the Danube, but within a generation or two, the Cimmerians no longer existed as a people. In memory, they became shadows. The world remembered them strangely. Herodotus confused them with the Scythians. Later, Greeks mixed them with the northern Cimbri of Europe. In Homer's Odyssey, they were placed in a land of endless night. A nation once feared across continents became little more than a half-remembered myth. Yet, though the people vanished, their impact remained. The kingdoms they struck never forgot. Phrygia collapsed under their raids and never recovered. Urartu was weakened. Even Assyria, though it celebrated victories, was shaken on its edges, and within a century it fell to the Medes and Babylonians. Only Lydia, scarred but alive, rose stronger under Alyattes and his son Croesus, filling the vacuum Phrygia left behind. The Greek cities, though burned, rebuilt. Ephesus later raised a grander temple to Artemis with Lydian wealth. The Cimmerians were gone, but for nearly a century they carried fear in their saddlebags. They humbled kings, burned cities, and reminded the world that power could appear suddenly, thundering from the horizon. And then, just as suddenly, they were gone, leaving behind only ruins, memories, and the lesson that no throne is ever safe when storms ride out of the steppe. Their origins were shrouded in myth. Their ending was obscure, but their brief, fiery age left scars on nations and reshaped the map of the ancient world. The Cimmerians, who owned no city, no kingdom, no crown, had shaken empires and slain kings. They were living proof that a people without walls could topple those who ruled behind them. For centuries, their story was retold as a warning that even the mightiest of kings could be humbled by warriors without a homeland. Their rise and fall in Lydia became a warning etched into history. Never underestimate the power of horsemen from the horizon, for they carried the fate of nations in their saddlebags.